So this week is Thanksgiving. And I know we don't say we have favorite holidays, but this is my favorite dinner. So I just love Thanksgiving dinner, um, especially when I cook it. But by then, you're not even hungry. But we think about Thanksgiving, and some of you who are visiting here for Thanksgiving don't have Thanksgiving where you come from. It's an American holiday. So we can just tell you all about it. But the crux of the sermon today is Thanksgiving. Well, it's the tests of Thanksgiving. So it's Thanksgiving in the midst of struggles, Thanksgiving in the midst of setbacks, and Thanksgiving in the midst of suffering. So we're going to start with Thanksgiving in the midst of struggles. The scripture verses are Genesis 22, verses 1 through 5. Have you ever faced struggles? Of course you have. We all have had troubles in the past. Just as many are facing struggles right now. And if we're realists, we will face struggles in the future. I heard someone say, we are either in a storm, I'm getting feedback here, but I don't know where that mic went. We are either in a storm, coming out of a storm, or headed to a storm. I'm going to turn mine down a little, see what happens. So we're either in the storm's coming, or we're getting out of one. If there was ever a man in the Bible who faced struggles, it was Abraham. He was acquainted with grief, heartache, and struggles. Now let's take a few moments and see how this mite of a man, the man of God, handled the struggles of life. If anyone would have wilted under life's struggles, it might have been this man, but he did not wilt. He worshiped. In Genesis 22, verse 1, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he said, behold, here I am. So that's what we can say when we think God's talking to us. Behold, here I am. King James Version. Look at the setting for the story before us. As the writer says, and it came to pass after these things. Well, after what? After all that he had previously been through in leaving the place of his birth, which was called Ur, of Chaldees, and moving to an unknown land and living among unknown people and following an unknown directive. This man, Abraham, was familiar with struggles, as the later half of his life was spent following God's plan, which was not revealed all at once. The Lord will never stop molding us, making us into the person he wants us to be. So just look at the life of Abraham. The Lord has watched him move from Ur of Chaldees to Haran, and then on to Canaan. He has struggled with his nephew Lot. He has struggled with the king of Egypt. He has wrestled with his own emotions and with the emotions of his wife, as they so desired a son. In time, we find Abraham and Sarah running ahead of the Lord as they devise a plan to help God out. So he gets with Hagar and brings forth Ishmael. But that was not the Lord's plan, nor would he recognize this child as being the firstborn of Abraham, nor the son of his covenant. The time of testing is now at hand, as the Lord is going to put forth his servant through the most severe and somber struggle of his life. Would he pass this test, or would he wilt under the pressure? Here's the kicker. Life is just one big test after another. And guess what? We never arrive, not till the end. Have you ever considered that the things that you might be facing right now might be part of a bigger picture? Let's look at verse 2. And he said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. The Lord came to Abraham, giving him stunning and somber directions, telling him to take Isaac, his only son, in the eyes of God, and take him to a distant mountain. And when he gets up there, he's to sacrifice the young man, as if offering him up as a burnt offering unto God. How would you have reacted? What would you have said? Kind of a tough question. Verse 3, and Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering. Clave, that's gathered it up, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. The first 7 words of that verse are stunning to me. And Abraham rose up early in the morning. Would you have gotten up that early? I might have slept in like some people have today. Then begged God to change his mind. This speaks of the measure of a man. If he can humbly and honorably accept the will of God, trusting him. They got up early. They loaded the wood, placing it on their beast of burden, took along 2 young servants, and off they go to yonder mountain, trusting God. Verse 4. Then on the 3rd day, that's how long they had to walk, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. Verse 5. And Abraham said to his young men, abide ye here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. On the 3rd day of their travels, Abraham could see the place, which was still far off, as he stops and leaves his young servants behind. This was all part of the plan. But then he says, I and the boy will go up there and worship. Then we will return. This is stunning and spectacular display of faith, as Isaac is a dead man walking. As they go up to the mountain, in the eyes of Abraham, the boy is already dead. But on the other hand, that boy was as good as alive, and he trusted God to raise him up from the dead. Abraham never wavered in going, nor did he waver in his commitment to follow the plan of God, as in his mind, he would sacrifice his son, proving to God that he loved him more than the boy. I don't know about you, but I've never faced any sort of struggle on this level. Have you? Can you offer up thanksgiving and worship in the midst of your struggles? Thanksgiving in the midst of setbacks. 2 Samuel 12, 16 through 20. Now, we previously discussed facing struggles in our lives. What about setbacks? Have you ever had your hopes up, excited about something that was going to happen, but then experienced a mighty setback? If we are truly honest with ourselves, most of us have experienced devastating setbacks, right? The word setback means something that happens, that delays or prevents a process from developing. It can also imply a reversal, a check in progress. I don't know about you, but I have experienced many setbacks in my life. But in the passage before us, we find King David facing a terrible setback. David, so this is verse 16. David therefore besought God for the child. And David, this is another example of David with his child. David fasted and went in and lay all night upon the earth. Now remember, King David was sitting in the palace. The nation was at war, but he stayed back. He went upon the rooftop of the palace, and there he looked over the city, and life was good. and he was now king. Maybe it was too good. As he looked over the nearby rooftops, what did he see? Bathsheba bathing. Well, should have ended right there. One cannot prevent an odd occurrence, but it did not end there. As the king kept on looking, as he goes from looking, it gets worse, much worse, as he sends for the woman. The king was looking, but then she was landing at his doorstep before long. The married woman announces her pregnancy to the married king, and it gets even worse as King David has Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's poor husband, murdered, though he was loyal and faithful to the nation, his wife, and unto his king, King of Israel. We now know him as King David. Wow. It gets worse, if you can fathom that. He goes on from looking to Bathsheba landing on his doorstep. But then he is found losing as the prophet of God appears with bad news, as though God had been watching him. Verse 27. And when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her, it's after she got over her husband being killed by him, to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. In time, King David brought Bathsheba to the palace, and she became his wife, and soon brought forth a son. And everything seemed okay, but it was not. You know why? Because the Lord was watching, and he was displeased with his servant. King David was a bit at ease, and then he committed adultery and then murder before finally marrying the woman and becoming the father of her child. The prophet of God called him out, informing him that the child would die. The child became sick, just as predicted. So we find King David fasting and praying, asking the Lord to spare his son. But this was an illness sent from heaven, and God chose to take the life of his son rather than the life of the king. King David laid upon the ground all night, begging and praying to God. Verse 17. And the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the earth, but he would not. Neither did he eat bread with them. The king refused to get up. He refused to eat, and he refused to stop praying because he now was facing the greatest setback of his life, and it was horrible. Verse 18. And it came to pass on the seventh day that the child died. And the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, Behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead? Verse 19. But when David saw that his servants whispered, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said unto his servants, Is the child dead? And they said, He is dead. The child died, and the king had gone without food or sleep for 7 days, and his servants feared telling the king. In time, King David realized that the servants were whispering. So he inquires as to the child's life, and they inform him that the boy is now dead. How would he react? Rather, what would he do? Verse 20. Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his apparel and came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. And then he came to his own house when he required. They set bread before him, and he did eat. As soon as King David receives the news, look at his actions. Well, he arises, he cleans himself up, he anoints himself, he changes his clothes, and goes to the house of the Lord. which is what we should do in the midst of our struggles. Devotedly worship our God. King David had committed an egregious sin, but he did not try to barter with the Lord. He repented. He prayed, but when the boy died, he clearly accepted the will of God. And he went to his house and he worshiped him. There will be times that we will face setbacks, but we must not get angry with the Lord, because many of our setbacks are kind of self-inflicted. As you live your life and setbacks come your way, just remember that God is in control and dare to worship him in the midst of your setbacks. Now, thanksgiving in the midst of suffering. Who suffered the most? Job. Chapter 1, verses 13 through 20. Now, we've talked about facing struggles and worshiping. And then we discussed having setbacks and how the King David chose to worship the Lord in the midst of his heartbreaking setback. That's what I call it. In the passage before us, we'll see Job and his mighty suffering. He could worship the Lord, but he faced the greatest test of all, suffering. The passage before us is the aftermath of an encounter between Satan and God, as Satan was giving permission to attack the fortune and family of Job. Physically, in the following verses, we will see the great suffering that Job faces as he loses nearly everything meaningful. Chapter 1, verse 13. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. Job 1:14. And there came a messenger unto Job. The oxes were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them. And the Sabines fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped to tell thee. It was a time of festivity, as Job's sons and daughters were gathered together, which shows us how intrusive Satan can be upon the affairs of mankind. While they were feasting, Satan moved upon some evil Sabines, and they swept in upon Job's servants as they were plowing with oxen and donkeys and killing the servants and capturing the beasts of burden. As Job looks up, here comes one of his servants. He's bringing a message of mourning as he shares all of the devastation with Job. He informs the mighty man of the Middle East as to his large loss as he falls down before Job. This was horrific news, but will soon get worse. 16. While he was yet speaking, there also came another and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven and has burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I only escaped to tell thee. Before the first servant was even completed his message, Job looks up, and another messenger is coming towards him. As he slumps down before his master, Job is about to get more bad news. Fire came down from heaven, burning up all his sheep and all of the servants that were overseeing them, all but this one servant, which brought forth the horrible news. Job is watching his fortune go down the drain as he experiences loss after loss. Now, let us be very careful in blaming God for natural disasters, but this fire that fell from heaven was not sent from God, from Satan. There are times that God allows Satan to have control over nature, so that this knowledge, we best be very careful in blaming God for things that happen in the natural realm. Verse 17. While he was yet speaking, there came also another. The Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away. Yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Two servants have brought Job terrible news, and before the second servant is done speaking, Job looks up, sees another servant coming with haste, and he tells him that the Chaldeans have swept in, killing his servants and stealing his cattle. As this one escapes, I can hear Job as he says, can it get any worse? It does. Verse 18. While he was yet speaking, there was also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they were dead. And I am only escaped alone to tell thee. Job looks and recognizes one of the servants that should have been with his children. As he grimaces and braces himself, what does this man have to say? Surely all is well with his children. This servant tells him that a great wind from the wilderness lifted up the house and destroyed it, each person and every person that is inside the house as his servant escapes. Job has lost his flocks. He's lost his mighty fortune. Now he's lost his family. All because Satan was allowed to test him, but more so because God himself was willing to hold Job up as a trophy of triumph. But would Job triumph in this moment? Or would he wilt like a flower, scorching weather? Verse 20. Then Job arose, he rent his mantle, that's like ripped off his clothes, outer clothes, and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshiped. What would you have done in the midst of this sort of suffering? How would you have responded? Would you have cursed God? Would you have become hardened against God or angry with him? Job responded just as Abraham and King David. He arose from the mighty catastrophe, ripped his mantle to display a time of mourning, shaved his head, and fell down to the ground before his God. And right then and there, we find him worshiping the Lord as he passed the test. We read about the struggles of Abraham as he embraced his mighty testing from the Lord. Then we looked upon King David as he faced a tremendous setback, praying for 7 long days, but then his son died. Yet he embraced the chastisement of God, passing his test. We looked on as Job suffered loss after loss till his flocks were gone. His fortune was erased in a matter of moments before he received the news that all 10 of his children were destroyed as the house fell upon them, killing them all. Yet he bowed down before his God, worshiping him, passing his test. Once again, we see God's servants passing their test and becoming worshipful and thankful, which is what each one of us should do this Thanksgiving. Amen and amen.